Well, hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. My name is Fred Nelson. I am the CEO of Maliasili. And thank you for joining us for this webinar on community-led conservation in Africa. Just before we get started and dive into things, I want just a few details on the logistics. This webinar will last for an hour and a half, for 90 minutes. We'll have mostly presentations from our speakers and a range of perspectives on community-led conservation for roughly the first hour, and then another half hour for discussion. We'll be fielding questions from the chat. So for everyone joining us, feel free to write questions into the chat. We will be pulling them and using some of them in our discussion to the panelists and also for follow-up after the webinar. And then the last just housekeeping note is that we have interpretation of English to French. So hopefully if you need interpretation in French, use the Zoom features to provide that. So this webinar, it's part of the Earth Week program done in collaboration with the Smithsonian Institution and their Earth Optimism and Conservation Commons programs. We're also convening it in collaboration with our close colleagues from the ICCA Consortium, the global network of more than 170 organizations from around the world, and so many leaders on indigenous and community-led conservation. Our topic here is really looking at community-led conservation in Africa and thinking about it in the global context and how we can scale up local leadership and solutions as a core part of addressing the daunting global challenges we face in biodiversity conservation, ecosystem health, planetary health, climate change, and as we reflect on the state of the planet and humanity with Earth Day tomorrow. At Maliasili, our work is focused on supporting local conservation organizations and leaders to do what they do better, to develop solutions that work for people and nature, and to be able to accelerate their impact. And we've got a great lineup of leaders from 4 of our partner organizations in 4 different countries in the region, all of whom are pioneers in community-based conservation. And they're going to share their experiences and insights from the places and the landscapes and the countries where they're working, and sharing insights on how we can accelerate progress globally on land and sea through community-based models. We'll also use the opportunity to reflect on how these kinds of community-based approaches fit within the wider global context of conservation policy and action in this critical year for conservation, for climate change, for trying to expand global ambitions and conservation commitments through the Convention on Biological Diversity and other measures. And we know that community-based conservation has got to be a key part of those expanded ambitions and impacts. And one of the real positive trends globally is this increasing recognition we're seeing of the centrality of indigenous and community-led conservation approaches as core to the solution to both the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis. And that if we're going to protect and restore ecosystems on a growing scale around the world, in Africa and globally, then indigenous people, local communities, local organizations and grassroots initiatives are a really critical and increasingly important element of that solution. And just a few kind of data points when we're thinking about the importance of those locally led approaches and solutions. Indigenous people and local communities are estimated to either own or use or have some claim over about 50% of all the land around the world, even though their legal rights to those lands and territories are only recognized on maybe 1/5 of that total area. So the scope just spatially of indigenous and local action is really central to the future of everywhere on Earth. 36% of all remaining intact forests globally are within indigenous lands, and indigenous people and other local communities in tropical countries manage about 22% of all forest carbon. And that's some of the reasons why particularly the climate and biodiversity agendas have really converged around the importance of indigenous and community lands. And really important to see how both biodiversity and climate policies and approaches are emphasizing indigenous and local leadership increasingly as a really critical shift. And in the African context, what is happening? What are the key models on the ground? And what needs to be done to accelerate progress is really the core of what we'll be learning about and discussing today. So with that as kind of the context for the session, we are going to have a number of speakers with different perspectives and different kind of points of engagement on this. We're going to start from kind of the high global level and just talk a little bit at the outset of the global context of conservation policies and discussions and this expanded effort globally through a range of networks and actors to expand conservation coverage and ambition. And our first guest is Brian O'Donnell, who's the director of the Campaign for Nature with the Wyss Foundation. Brian is joining us from Durango, Colorado. Most of his professional background has been working in the Western United States and Alaska, working to protect, restore, and finance millions of acres of lands in the Western United States. He's been the executive director of the Conservation Lands Foundation and worked with the Wilderness Society and the Alaska Wilderness League, among others, and now is leading this global campaign for nature, which is trying to expand global conservation coverage and protections. So Brian's going to share some kind of global perspective on those efforts and on how indigenous and local leadership fits in.
Well, thank you, Fred, and it's really exciting to be part of this important webinar today, and the exciting part of Earth Week as we focus on some of the optimistic and positive things that are happening around the planet.
That's all. I'm gonna bring this.
One second there. Okay. Many of you listening to this webinar will recall that in May of 2019, the Intergovernmental Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which is known as IPBES, released the most comprehensive analysis of the state of nature on the planet. Its global biodiversity assessment brought together hundreds of scientists from around the world, along with experts in indigenous and local knowledge systems. And for those of you who read the report, you'll remember that the report's conclusions were really alarming. It's found that nature was declining globally at rates unprecedented in human history, and that the rate of species extinctions is accelerating with grave impacts to people around the world now likely. I remember reading it and feeling like I had just taken a punch to the gut. It called for a way out of this challenge. It said that we needed to make transformational changes in the way we in the world address nature in all facets of our lives and societies. But it also noted the leading causes of biodiversity decline currently were land degradation, habitat loss, and overexploitation in the oceans. One part of those solutions it called for was an increase in protected and conserved areas. And it highlighted the essential role that indigenous peoples and local communities and their knowledge systems play in safeguarding nature around the world. This year, as Fred mentioned, is a major opportunity. We are seeing environmental negotiations and strategies being debated by more than 190 parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity, known as the CBD. Land and ocean conservation targets are likely to be adopted at the CBD Conference of Parties in Kunming, China in October, and as nature-based solutions to the climate at the Climate COP in Glasgow in November. The current draft of the CBD post-2020 biodiversity framework, which is its 10-year plan to safeguard biodiversity, includes a number of targets to address habitat and land and ocean conservation. It's currently including an area-based conservation target of protecting at least 30% of the world's lands and oceans by 2030 through protected areas and other effective conservation measures, including indigenous and community conserved areas. Now, we know that historically, protected areas have not always respected the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities, and in some cases have led to violence, displacement, and human rights violations. So a path forward for increasing global conservation must center the voices and approaches of indigenous peoples and local communities and honor free, prior, and informed consent. And we need significant new financial flows to secure land tenure rights. So I'm excited to hear from today's speakers. They have shown how community-led conservation works for people and nature. If we are to meet the global biodiversity and climate goals and address a crisis facing nature, then we need to listen to a diversity of voices, learn from a diversity of approaches, and work together across the globe to increase our ambition for nature. I'm optimistic about the opportunities for success this year and for setting even more ambitious global biodiversity targets simply because of the work of the panelists you'll hear from today. Their local work makes global ambition possible. In fact, without indigenous and community-led conservation, that global ambition isn't possible. So I'm excited to hear from them, and I'm excited to see how their local work can make this global ambition a success. So thank you, Fred.
Thanks so much, Brian. Yes, I think our core theme here, and really in thinking about conservation in the future, is how do we make the global and the local really in synergy, which hasn't always been the case in conservation in Africa and other places around the world. So now to provide another perspective on that kind of global to local synergy opportunities and maybe some of the challenges, and from an African perspective, and one of the collaborating organizations in this campaign for nature, as I mentioned, is the ICCA Consortium, which is a global network of organizations all working to advance indigenous and local communities, and includes many member organizations from local communities. And in fact, 3 of the panelists and their organizations are members of the ICCA Consortium. And representing the ICCA Consortium as the coordinator for Eastern Africa is Emmanuel Sule, a close colleague of ours. And joining us from his home in Arusha in northern Tanzania, Emmanuel's a leading expert on land rights and land tenure, and has researched and written widely on land and natural resource governance issues in Tanzania and the wider region, and worked at the University of Western Cape's program on land and agrarian studies as well, where he did his PhD a few years back. So Emmanuel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fred, for that generous introduction. I want to emphasize that we are globally known as ICCAs, of territories of life. So our members will be representing those territories of life. So in this important event, on behalf of ICCAs, I want to make following remarks. First, on the 20th of May this year, in honor of the International Day of Biological Diversity, the ICCA Consortium will release the first global report on ICCA, the territories of life. The report takes a modular local to global approach. It has 17 community case studies, 6 national and regional case studies, and global spatial analysis co-produced with the United Nations Environmental Program's World Conservation Monitoring Center. It also includes a summary for policymakers involved in the CBD processes that speaks directly to the key issues in the draft post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The report adds to a growing body of evidence, likely Fred and others will be mentioning, and Fred has already mentioned some, that indigenous peoples and local communities are playing an outsized role in the health and the future of our planet. Therefore, the forthcoming global analysis estimates that they are protecting and conserving at least 20% of the world's land, with much of this land identified already as a key biodiversity areas and highly intact. Therefore, from our reports, we find that whether through a 50-acre sacred grove in Rajasthan, India, or through a 12 million hectare territory in Nunavut, Canada, communities are sustaining an astounding diversity of species, habitats, and ecosystems through their governance systems and ways of life. It is really important to emphasize that it's not only that the governance, it's the community-based ways of governing natural resources that is embedded in their ways of life. In Congo, DRC, and Guinea, customary forests, and sacred sites are at the heart of communities' identities and culture. We know in China, community is bringing back a critically endangered species of longuo from the brink of extinction. We also know that some recent advances that are being made in conservation highlight the importance of communities. There is a growing evidence in knowledge-based political and social recognition, solidarity and support networks, and opportunities for recognition within certain legal frameworks, including conservation. We highlight that legal recognition of human rights overall, and more importantly, of indigenous people's rights, including collective land rights and territories and self-determined governance institutions, are key elements in enabling communities to respond and adapt to threats and shocks, more likely shocks related to climate change and environmental degradation. It is particularly important that for communities to have a band of options for recognition and support to choose from their context and also self-determined priorities. We highlight that indigenous peoples and local communities are also on the front lines of defending their lands and territories and nature with them against industrial activities that are destructive, and many of them are facing threats and violence in doing so. Other global studies are also supporting our finding that those who are defending indigenous rights and environment are most at risk of violence and killings. Although advances within conservation frameworks are undeniably important for communities, this will be insufficient if it's not paired with halting industrial and violent threats. We also find that it is important that within the post-2020 global biodiversity framework overall, and with specific targets such as target number 2 on 2030, parties should recognize human rights and the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. More importantly, they should include recognition of their self-determined governance systems and collective land rights and territories. Finally, we find that overall, there are many positive advances, but clearly there is a lot of work still to do. It is through gatherings like this, when we can share experiences and lessons learned, that we can build our collective understanding of what needs to be done and how best to work together in our diverse roles in support of communities in the region and around the world. And I believe the next speakers from different parts of Africa will present such rich ideas on how we can build and support communities around the globe. Thank you very much. Over to you, Fred.
Thanks so much, Emmanuel. And yeah, just to emphasize this, the ICCA Consortium, as Emmanuel said, will be releasing a major global report on ICCAs next month. So everyone look out for that. It'll be including descriptions of some of the countries and cases that are discussed here. And also really emphasizing, Emmanuel, the centrality of strengthening collective land and resource rights as a really critical part of the policy agenda and strategies for accelerating community-led conservation approaches. Okay, so now having just framed the importance of these issues, as Brian and Emmanuel both said, in terms of the centrality both of accelerating action at the global level, at local, at national levels, and of supporting community-driven solutions within that global conservation context. We'll now zero in on some of the leading examples and landscapes and what's actually happening in Africa in terms of developing solutions and bringing those to scale in some really significant ways that can inform practices in other countries and indeed around the world. So our first presentation will be from Hilma Angula. She is representing the Namibian Association of CBNRM Support Organizations in Namibia, known as NACSO. NACSO is a collaborative organization that has been around for about 20 or more years, and has really been central to the collaboration, the partnerships between civil society, government, local organizations, and the conservancies in Namibia that create the main vehicle for community conservation. And Namibia really provides an example of what is possible in terms of conservation at scale when community approaches and private lands approaches and government protected areas are all really working in concert, and when leadership is coming from the local level, from the government level, to drive these kinds of approaches forward. And Hilma's going to share kind of an overview of the Namibian approach and what it's achieved and what we can learn from it. So Hilma, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you, Fred. And welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. As Fred has introduced me, I'm Hilma Angula and I'm from Namibia. And here is a tale of Namibia's community conservation and its challenges, opportunities, as well as the impact that it has had over the years. Namibia is located in sub-Saharan Africa. It's bordering the Atlantic Ocean to the west, South Africa, Botswana, and Angola to the south, east, and north, respectively. It is the second least densely populated country in the world, second only to Mongolia, with a population of 2.4 million people. The country is home to a diversity of wildlife, including some of Africa's iconic species, such as elephants, rhinos, and cheetahs. And therefore, wildlife conservation is central to our economy, and it is also important to us as a people and our heritage and our culture. Namibia, like many countries across the world, initially adopted the fortress conservation approach back in the 80s. And this saw local communities being moved from areas deemed necessary for wildlife conservation. Etosha National Park, for example, is one such area where communities were translocated to make way for wildlife. This has created communities or caused communities to be very antagonistic against conservation, which led to increased poaching incidences and plummeting wildlife numbers back in the 80s. This was the case until Namibia changed the approach by amending its policies, and especially the Act 5 of 1996, and granting rights to local communities to manage wildlife and benefit from such in a sustainable manner. With these rights, communities became the custodians of the land. They have been given or allocated the rights to manage natural resources on their land and wildlife within the lands within where they live. It has improved their way of living. It has also given local communities the right and the voice in the management of wildlife within the area. The new conservation approach brought new hope for local communities, and it has changed the dynamics of what conservation meant for the country and for us as a people. Traditional knowledge was now acknowledged and applied, and local communities had the right to decide how to manage wildlife that occurred on their lands. They also had the voice to agree and to decide on what forms of benefits they want to derive and how to manage this wildlife and these resources within their own lands. And therefore they formed what we call community conservancies, and these are locally managed wildlife protection areas. Today we have 86 total in the country, boosting our conservation approach and our wildlife numbers. Within these conservancies, communities were derived benefits. They were also given the rights to decide how, when, and where to look after the wildlife. They became the eyes and the ears on the ground. Poaching incidences declined drastically, and then the tolerance or the acceptance of wildlife and the cost that comes with that was also accepted by the local people. And at scale, our conservation story changed. Because before 1996, when we had no community conservation practices in place, it was only 13% of our land that was under some form of protection through the state protected areas. But today, with 86 communal conservancies and other community-based initiatives, we are looking at 46% of our country's land under some form of protection. And this is about 180,000 square kilometers of Namibia's land, home to about 227,000 people. With this new conservation story, our natural resource management improved significantly. People's lives also improved. The landscape connectivity widened and our wildlife numbers, wildlife populations increased. If you can move on to the next slide, please. And notable among the species or wildlife populations that have really increased, we look at our black rhino population that was near extinct back in the 80s. And today we are looking at the largest free roaming population in the world. The elephant population was merely 7,000 back in 1995. And today we have more than 22,000 elephants across our country. Our lion population is also notable, and it has increased. In the lion rates, we only had about 20 lions in 1995, and today there's over 150 in that landscape. This is proof that community conservation, and when people have the rights over wildlife and they're the custodians on the land, they truly become the eyes and the ears on the ground, and they look after wildlife and they let wildlife within the land thrive. If we compare to Kruger National Park, for example, where significant human and financial resources have been invested in protecting wildlife within that park, there has been plummeting declines in wildlife, especially in iconic species such as rhinos and elephants. And as we can see here, the conservation approach of Namibia has also been about deriving economic returns to communities. It has really been about making wildlife and natural resources an economic asset for local communities. And therefore, it has brought investment into rural communities. It has brought investment into remote areas of the country. Joint venture tourism, crafts, the use of wildlife species as well as plant products has brought significant returns to our communal areas. As you can see on this graph, for example, in the past 10 years, there has been an exponential growth in the returns coming to local communities. There has been income generated in areas that would have, in any other situation, not been there. Local people have also benefited significantly from employment opportunities, with conservancies alone employing over 5,000 local communities within the country. Despite our successes, we have endured a number of challenges. Human-wildlife conflict and droughts have been at the center of this, but this year particularly, we have been challenged by the COVID-19 pandemic that has brought significant financial losses and impacts to our tourism sector and important in the economic sector for our conservancies. But it has also been an opportunity for us to look at ways of diversifying income and economic streams for our countries. And we are looking at different approaches, looking at wildlife credits as an initiative to do that, for example. It has also reinforced the importance of collaboration and in providing support to community conservation interventions between government entities and non-governmental organizations. The way that our government and our NGOs and our donor partners came together to collect some funding through the CRRF fund, which is the Community Relief, Resilience and Recovery Fund, to ensure that employment within communal conservancies is retained and that essential services still continued is remarkable. This was an intervention that came together very quickly when the pandemic hit us to ensure that our conservation story remains and that those who have been employed and the essential services still continued. The limited funding to the program has been a challenge, of course, with the expansion in conservation areas looking at 86 across the country. It has significantly required funding, but with the limited funding, this has been challenging. But it has also developed an opportunity for us to look at innovative and long-term financing mechanisms like the Community Conservation Fund of Namibia, where we're looking at drawing in investment from different donors to really avail long-term funding to support our communal conservancies. Land use changes has been challenging for us as well. The current oil and exploration that is taking place in the Kavango Delta and within Namibia, specifically the Kavango East, has been a challenge to us because it directly goes against the principles of the program. But this is an eye-opener for us as conservation practitioners to really look at making wildlife conservation an economic deriving opportunity that would go within our development agendas and that would complement the efforts of the governments, especially in trying to address the issue of poverty. So we need, it has been an eye-opener for us to look at wildlife as an economic-based approach in eradicating poverty and also in enhancing development agendas within the countries. And lastly, the CBNRM program creates an opportunity to inform policy reform and conservation efforts globally. It is an opportunity, it provides an opportunity for us all to learn and look at what has been working and what has not been working and how conservation at scale can really be implemented. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hilma. I've been saying to people for many years, if you want to be inspired about what's possible in conservation, go to Namibia and see. And I think in terms of conservation at scale and in terms of taking a unique approach with such strong local and national leadership that's really all around shifting rights to local people and making wildlife and wild places an economic asset, are really the hallmarks of, as you said, taking conservation to scale. And really what Namibia has achieved is what we're hoping for in other countries and globally in the years ahead. So continuing on kind of the themes of African leaders in community conservation, we'll now hear the story from Kenya, where also a conservancies movement, conservancies with a somewhat different legal and national context, but where a conservancies movement is also really driving conservation at scale. Conservancies in Kenya, private, community conservancies of different form now cover about 11% of the country, an area larger than state protected areas, and are really central to increasing conservation ambitions there. And we'll hear about conservancies in the Masai Mara, which has been a key region for innovations in working in partnership with local communities and landowners, and from Daniel Sophia, who's the CEO of the Masai Mara Wildlife Conservancies Association in the Mara, and a key leader in both the local and national conservancies movement. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Fred, and good morning to all our listeners from different parts of the world, and welcome to the Masai Mara. I'm going to take you through these presentations. Masai Mara is situated in the southern parts of the country, bordering the Tanzania on the north side, that is now bordering the Serengeti National Park. Masai Mara is one of the world famous wildlife destinations, known and most visited globally. 25% of the total wildlife in the country are found in the Masai Mara. The story about the conservancies in Kenya, Fred has already mentioned very briefly that 11% of the countries is under conservation, and that's an area that is occupied by the community conservancies. with the government and state protected areas, that is the national parks and reserves, covering about 8%. We today have about 160 conservancies in Kenya. That's about 15 million acres of land. The Mara actually is one of the very good examples, have already been mentioned, and conservancies are actually the new important sort of conservation models in the countries so far. And I think Mara is one of those very good examples. Today, we have a total of 16 community conservancies in the Mara, covering an area of about 1,500 square kilometers, which is equal to the size of Masai Mara National Reserve. With the coming up of the community conservancies over the last 1 decade, the conservation efforts has doubled up in the Mara. The entire ecosystem is about 6,000 square kilometers, where now half of the ecosystem is under conservation with the coming up of the community conservancies, as well as the Masai Mara National Reserve. Conservancies is also a recognized form of land use in Kenya, thanks to the Wildlife Conservation and Management Act of 2013, where community conservancies are now recognized as a form of land use. And that has actually been one of the things that has also led to the growth of the community conservancies in Kenya. Conservancies are sort of legal entities that also have governance structures where you have landowners committees. We have also management companies that's made up of landowners as well as the investors or the tourism partners. And therefore it's actually it has actually a lot of sort of a governance structures that ensures equal representations and as well as the benefit distribution evenly across all the conservancies. What makes actually what we have seen actually in the Mara conservancies over the years is that based on the interventions to date over the last 10 years with the communities, we've really seen a return of a very critical endangered wildlife species. We're talking about the wild dogs, which have kind of disappeared early 90s because of the rabies. And today, with all these 16 conservancies, we have really seen a return of key wildlife species, including wild dogs. We've also seen an increase in other wildlife species such as elephants, cheetahs, and lions. We have also been able to open up critical wildlife corridors, 2 major ones. We have a total of 8 other critical corridors that are yet to be opened, with 3 of them in the short term. And those are some of the interventions that have actually been sort of put on plan to, as we look forward into bringing the area that is currently not under conservation as well to be part of the 16 conservancies. The other thing that I can also mention very briefly, sorry, on the earlier slide before we get into this one, is about how conservancies have also transformed livelihoods here in the Mara. We're talking about over 15,000 individuals, title holders, who have put their land and leased their land into the conservancy, who are receiving up to a tune of $7.5 million US in forms of lease payments and salaries. Some of the recorded impact to date. In 2014, we had a total of about 8 conservancies. Today, we have about 17 conservancies. That is just in sort of 7 years. The area under conservation was 970 square kilometers. As I mentioned today, we have an area of over 1,500 square kilometers. 3,000 landowners who are receiving lease payment or who have leased their land to the conservancy in 2014 to over 15,000 individual landowners to date. We're also talking about 362 rangers drawn from the 17 conservancies. These are all drawn from the local community. We are also talking about a high lion density that is really coming up 15%. More than 2,000 residents that are also employed as rangers or working in the tourism camps and lodges that are operating within the conservancies. And also mention about ability to have secured critical wildlife corridors that has also helped to connect these conservation areas who actually could easily be disjointed by some of the threats that we are also witnessing across the conservation fraternity. With those success and achievements, all this is not without challenges. Mara is one of the areas that has quite a number of challenges. And this is also as a result of the land tenure system. As I mentioned earlier, we're talking about a private land that has been subdivided 20 years ago, and thousands of Maasais hold title deeds for all these pieces of land. They have the rights to fence, sell, subdivide further, and that actually has been presenting a big challenge. So fencing is one of the biggest things that is actually fragmenting the landscape. And this is one of the biggest challenges, as you can actually see in those maps. The first map is indicating the green part being the national reserve. We have the yellow bits being the conservancies that are buffering the national reserve. We have the red pieces, those are the fences up in 1985. And looking at the right slide, on the right-hand side, you can actually see how fences has actually intrude into the Conservancy's borderline. To some extent, they are actually even threatening to push further into their core in some other conservancies. So fencing is one of the big problems we are really battling with, and this is brought about by land subdivision and privatization. We're also talking about a growing human population, which is also growing at unprecedented rate. And with all those sort of competition brings quite a challenge in terms of the land use. And those are some of the serious challenges we are actually facing in the landscape. It's also good to mention that one of the other challenge, although it's also important to mention the positive side of it, is that with the 25% of the total wildlife found in the Masai Mara landscape, we're talking about 80% of tourists that visit Kenya, they end up in the Masai Mara. The model has actually been relying heavily on tourism. And I think with the situations that present at the moment, like the COVID, it really becomes quite difficult to sustain the model because of the restrictions in terms of travels. But on the positive side of it is that conservancies operate on a low volume tourism, which actually brings a sort of a low carbon footprint, but also exclusive wildlife experience. And that has actually been a major and an important part of the experience that the conservancies are actually offering as a unique tourism product. In terms of the opportunities, we are talking about an ecosystem which is 6,000 square kilometers. The Masai Mara National Reserve is already covering 1,500 square kilometers. The community conservancies have also bringing a similar area under conservation, and we're talking about half of the ecosystem under conservation as we speak. There is an opportunity to really bring an additional land from the remaining 3,000 square kilometers under conservation. We can also talk about the enabling policies from the national level, talking about the Wildlife Conservation and Management Act, which now recognizes conservancies as a form of land use. That is another important thing. We're also talking about community interest and willingness because of the benefit they have already been receiving in conservancies. They're actually showing a lot of interest to bring in additional land and leasing their land to the conservancies. Yeah, so that is the end of my very brief presentations. Hope you enjoyed. And I would like to encourage that you could, if you could actually visit our website and you could be able to learn more about our work. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel. That was great. Great view into the pioneering work that you and your organization and colleagues are leading in the Masai Mara again, to emphasize the uniqueness of this model of pooling individually owned properties on Maasai lands into, of over 15,000 landowners into these collective conservancies now. So from Namibia and Kenya and these pioneering models in savanna environments, we're going to now go to the marine environment along the coastline of Madagascar. Of course, one of the top global hotspots of biodiversity and critical area for conservation. And again, we're somewhat similar to Namibia and Kenya. Over the last decade, Madagascar has become a pioneer regionally and globally in locally managed marine areas. And these hundreds of local areas where communities are able to manage their coral reefs and fisheries and marine environments are brought together through this network of Mahari. And Vatasu Rakotondrazafi was the coordinator of Mahari and has really led the network to growth and to becoming a national movement in Madagascar over the past 6 years. She's now the president of the board and also working with a new organization called INDRI, a Malagasy think tank working on collective action around environmental issues. She won a Whitley Award for Nature a few years ago for her work with Mahari. And Vatasu, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Fred, for the introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. So I'm Vatsu, and I advocate for the rights of Madagascar small-scale fishers, which is estimated to be around 500,000. And I'm here today to share with you an amazing approach that we have been developing in Madagascar since 2004, which is the locally managed marine area. Madagascar is, I know that Madagascar is famous because of the movie, but what is important to know is that, Madagascar is also the fourth largest island in the world, with a coastline estimated to be more than 5,000 kilometers. And it is a country that is located in the Indian Ocean off the coast from South Africa, with about 26 million population, and where the activities are mainly on agriculture, fisheries, and tourism. Madagascar is also known as a biodiversity hotspot with 80% endemicity. So for the case of the LMMA, the concept of LMMA was born in the southwest of the island, with communities that came together to manage locally led octopus closures. But for the LMMA was originally, it emerged from the Pacific and in Asia in the 90s. And for the case of Madagascar, we got our first LMMA in 2004. We have about 3 governance mechanisms for the LMMA in Madagascar. The first of them is LMMA that are managed by the DINA, which is the local, the bylaw convention that manage the natural resources of Madagascar. The second, the type of governance and type of LMMA is marine protected areas under the IUCN category 5 and 6. And the third one is managed through a law called GELOS. And this is actually a contract where the government transfer the management of mangroves area to communities. So today we have about 200 LMMA in Madagascar. 79% of them are supported by NGO, and 21% remaining are called independent LMMA or orphan LMMA, which means that they do not have the support from the NGO in their activities. And those LMMA are covering more than 17,000 square kilometers of Madagascar continental shelf, which means that they are a lot, and we have more LMMA than marine protected areas in Madagascar, which means also that we need actually to really empower those LMMA communities And the LMMA are present in 11 of the 13 coastal regions of Madagascar. Yeah, in terms of the management models, the LMMA in Madagascar have about four. They have four models. The first of them is that those LMMA create temporary and permanent fisheries closures, especially for octopus. So just a testimony that I got from a fisher since he developed the LMMA approach, his octopus catch went from 500 kilos to 800 kilos within 1 year, thanks to the closures that they developed in LMMA. And they also restore mangroves. And within LMMA, one of the biggest challenges that they have is the destruction of their mangroves because of charcoal production. So since they restore mangroves, I also have a story from a fisher from the northwest of Madagascar, where he put in place the LMMA approach a few years ago. Then today he have about 95% of his land covered with 9 types of mangroves. The two last models are, next please. The two remaining models are the LMMA communities that develop also alternative livelihoods, such as aquaculture, sea cucumber, and farming. So they do not rely only on fisheries for their livelihoods. So another story that I have is in the southwest of Madagascar, there is a community that got about 400 tons of seaweed in 2020, based on the alternative livelihoods that they are developing. And the last management model is that those communities are putting in place local regulations that it is mainly on the bans on destructive fishing practice. Next, please. So those LMMAs are facing lots of challenges, and one of the biggest challenges of those LMMAs are the resource allocation, especially the conflict between industrial and traditional fishers, and also the fact that they are really isolated. But we can say that the LMMA model in Madagascar have lots of impact in terms of socio-economic well-being, the ecology and biology, the governance, and the fisheries management and production. Next, please. So as the conflict of the LMMA, as I said, one of the biggest challenges of LMMA is the conflict with industrial fishing in terms of resource allocation, but also our first LMMA, it is 18 years, but there is still no legal framework that recognizes the rights of those LMMA. But those LMMA are also isolated and located in remote area, which means that they do not have the opportunity to share experiences and to be heard. Next, please. That is why we've created the Mihari Network in 2012 that advocate for the rights of those small-scale fishers to build their capacity in leadership and also allow peer-to-peer learning between fishers. As the impact of Mihari, we have Mihari is today, next please, Mihari is today one of the most successful civil society movement in the Indian Ocean. Small-scale fishers are heard, they are involved in decision-making, and we have about 1,000 change makers around Madagascar that really try their best to contribute in the sustainable management of the country. Their voices are heard, but there is still some improvement to do, especially in terms of being consulted for fisheries agreement with industrial fisheries in Madagascar. So to end my presentation, I'm just sharing with you, can you go to the next slide, please? Just sharing with you this, yeah, okay. So for some opportunities of Mihari, in 2017, small-scale fishers made 3 requests to be addressed to the government, funders, and private sectors to formalize their DINA, which is the Local Dialogue Convention of Communities. and also to create an exclusive fishing zone for small-scale fishers so that we can resolve the conflict with industrial fisheries. And today, there was an engagement from our Ministry of Fisheries to create that exclusive fishing zone for small-scale fishers. So it was a success. To end my presentation, next, please. To end my presentation, I just would like to share this photo of the global recognition that Mihai got in 2019, which means that today, the small-scale fishers of Madagascar, their voices are heard, but the LMMA model still need to be officially recognized for their work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vatasu, and really another inspiring example and highlighting the importance both of that legal recognition, as you said, as really a critical issue in strengthening and scaling these kinds of models and efforts, but also the importance of social movements and organizational movements and networks, such as you've been involved in creating and leading in order to scale up all the individual community efforts. So just as a reminder to everyone in the audience, so we've got another half hour, we got one more presentation, and then we'll have a little bit of time for some discussion across the panelists and connecting the different case examples. And everyone's welcome to submit questions in the chat. Some of those we might incorporate into the discussion, or they might be answered individually by panelists or by others on our team. So now for our final presentation, we're going to turn to Northern Tanzania and Pine Mako, who's the executive director of the Ujamaa Community Resource Team based in Arusha in Northern Tanzania, working across about 80 different communities in the northern part of the country with a range of different indigenous hunter-gatherer and pastoralist communities. And really, UCRT has established itself as one of the African leaders in the realm of indigenous and community land rights and natural resource rights, and helping communities secure their lands and their territories and improve their management, both for their own livelihoods and for the incredible ecosystems that both people and wildlife and livestock depend on in northern Tanzania. So Pine, welcome, over to you.
So thank you, Fred, for the introduction, and I'm glad to join in the discussion. So as Fred said, my name is Pine from Tanzania, and the Ujamaa Community Resource Team next slide, please. Yeah. So Ujamaa Community Resource Team is a grassroots organization that seeks to improve the lives of pastoralists, agro-pastoralists, and hunter-gatherers communities in the northern part of the country. This we do by empowering communities to sustainably manage and benefit from natural resources on which our lives depend on. So Ujamaa Community Resource Team believes that empowering communities is a fundamental step towards a just and sustainable, not only society, but environment. So where we are located, Tanzania is located in the east part of Africa, and Ujamaa Community Resource Team works in the northern part of the country, where most of the indigenous lands of pastoralists and hunter-gatherers and agro-pastoralists is found. So these lands also, it's important to know that it borders some of Africa's most famous wildlife areas, such as the Ngorongoro Conservation Area, the Serengeti, among others. So wildlife and livestock and the people coexist. They migrate across rangelands. They depend on the same water sources. And of course, they feed on the same grazing areas. So this means for us that wildlife, pastoralism, hunting and gathering are all interconnected, and it's very necessary that land is open, connected, and healthy for the survival of people and wildlife. So our approach, we do security of tenure, but again, without the governance structures in place, the security of tenure cannot succeed. So, but again, also to enhance sustainability, it's crucial that communities from their natural environment. So our indigenous communities own, use and manage land communally. To secure tenure, you first have to ensure that village boundaries are defined, and in the process, you have to resolve conflicts that come along. So, and after doing so, and for those who do not know what a village is, it's the smallest political unit in Tanzania. And 70% of Tanzania's land is within the village land. So after you have a village land certificate, we undertake a land use plan, which communities segment different uses of their land, such as settlement, farming areas, grazing areas, and so on. So after you have done a land zoning process, we further, considering that our communities use land and natural resources communally, we further demarcate and create legal tenure for the open community land to enhance the livelihoods of the people. We also support communities to build their capacity of local governing institutions, and not just to build their capacity. If the institutions don't exist, we support create those institutions. And of course, those institutions help protect land and natural resources. Once they exist and they're functional, they support in the management and protection of land and natural resources. But again, when we look at benefit, we collaborate with business institutions that are ethical in nature, that support community efforts with nature-based incentives. Some of these business entities are like Carbon Tanzania and tourism companies, among others. So this helps generate income for communities that support establishment and running of some social services within the community. So we realize that when communities benefit, they feel obliged to protect and manage land and natural resources effectively and efficiently. So the importance of this approach of securing community land through legal tenure is one, to secure pasture land for pastoral groups, but again, to ensure that the hunter-gatherers communities also have secure food that they get from the environment. Hunter-gatherers hunt and gather for survival. They collect wild fruits, tubers, honey, and even hunt for food. But again, this approach is critical in terms of reducing conflict between different land users. But also critical is that this approach ensures the movement of people. You know, pastoralists and hunter-gatherers need to move from place to place, but again, also the movement of wildlife in the natural open environment. So, but again, it's also critical because it prevents internal encroachment, it prevents land grabbing, and not just by individuals, but also national parks. Next slide, please. So in emphasizing what we do, I will focus on one of our communities, the communities we work with, the Hadzabe, one of the last hunter-gatherer tribes of Africa. And I'll tell you a little story about them and then go into what we have done in the area. So the Aeda and Lekeyasi ecosystem is the area where the Hadzabe and also pastoral groups are found, is homeland to the Hadzabe hunter-gatherers, who total to about only 1,300 in number. It's a community that to date depend on hunting and gathering economy, and their lifestyle, like pastoralists, is nomadic. This lifestyle is crucial for the ecosystem because it gives land time to regenerate. When the Hadzabe return to the land, months or even years later, the land has regenerated and the resources are once again abundant. So since 2011, Ujamaa Community Resource Team, with the support of several other organizations, have been helping secure the Hadzabe land, which has been diminishing quite fast. Next slide, please. So in this slide, as I have mentioned before, critical to securing land tenure is securing communal land areas, which we do through certificates of customary right of occupancy that are communal. So based on the fact that indigenous people of the Aeda kept losing their land, there was an urgent need to rescue the remaining land for their use and that of wildlife that exists within the area. As you can see from the map, the stretch of community land is connected to a very famous conservation area, Ngorongoro Conservation Area. And this not only enhances mobility for people, but also for the wildlife that moves from Ngorongoro to these open lands. So over the years, or about 10 years, we've been able to secure that stretch of land. This, in the map, you can see the green areas and labeled areas are all villages that we've been able to work with over the years. Of course, it took a long time because of conflicts that you have to resolve over time. A village can take to up to a year or even more, depending on the nature of conflict, to be able to secure the land within that area. So the well-planned and organized land, sorry, back. Thank you. So well-planned and organized land and natural resource systems are attractive to investors. Therefore, over time, the Aeda and Mangola Valley increased tourism revenue from tourists who not only visit wildlife and the beautiful landscape scenery, but also the lifestyle and culture of the people. So business companies such as Carbon Tanzania were also able to enter into agreement with communities for the sale of carbon offsets. So in our next slide, we look at the impact of securing land over time. So over the years, we've been working for 20 years now. We've been able to secure over 1 million hectares of critical habitat and community land within the landscape within northern Tanzania through certificates of customary rights of occupancy. And the result of that, between 20 and 2021 alone, communities that protected and managed their resources well were able to enter into agreements with business entities that earned them over $1 million US, specifically on the carbon offset sales. Tourism is not accounted, but it's also generating a lot of money for communities. Of course, with COVID, tourism revenues was drastically affected, unlike the carbon offset that was a bit more stable for communities. So the community revenue supports social services within the community, such as building health centers, construction or rehabilitation of water sources, or even paying scholarship for students. So the good work is not without challenges, and there are many, but I'll only mention two for now. One is the land acquired by hunter-gatherers and pastoralists seem to be unused because the group is moving with season or their grazing patterns. You know, they move from one place to the other. And this makes them particularly vulnerable to losing their land. So again, the process of securing land is quite, it takes a lot of time. It needs a lot of resources. It needs a lot of patience. And so this process can be very costly in so many ways. And sometimes this slows down the work we do. So looking at the opportunities are many. You know, the landscape is big. Community land, indigenous land that is critical for survival for communities and wildlife still needs to be secured. But along with that, we need to ensure that governing structures not only exist, they are functioning, they know their roles and responsibilities, and they are able to do their roles, to undertake their roles and responsibilities. But again, community systems adaptively, we need to continue supporting communities to adaptively improve and strengthen their natural resource management systems and practices. And lastly, but not least, it's important to continue building strategic partnerships with ethical investors and organizations to support this critical work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pine. That was a great overview of UCRT's pioneering work in Tanzania. So we've got about 15 minutes left. Just if all the Vatasu and Daniel and Hilma and Pine, if you could just turn your videos on, I just want to go around to everyone and draw together a few threads in the time remaining. I think one of the most striking things, and I'm sure for me and probably for many in the audience as well, has been, you know, all of you are kind of young African leaders, voices for new approaches to conservation, right? Community-based approaches. A lot of these models have evolved in the past 5, 10, 15 years and are all trying to do conservation differently with local people, securing rights, benefits, and restoring ecosystems and nature in the process. And I'd like to ask each of you just briefly to give a thought on kind of how is conservation in the region today different from how it's been in the past? What's kind of distinctive about the community-based approaches now, and kind of the bigger change that you're all trying to bring to how conservation is done in Africa?
Well, Fred, if I may kick off from Kenya, Masai Mara side, I think what makes this quite different from how conservation has been run in the past is the approach we are seeing today. We are seeing this as from a bottom-top approach. Unlike before, it was sort of like, it was more like a top-down. It is also because of the local community who are in the front line in accelerating for these changes. These are the people who have coexisted with wildlife for centuries. It's part of their life. They know how to maneuver through most of these issues. And therefore, with their traditions and culture has allowed them to interact and coexist with wildlife. And I think today's change that we are noticing positively is a result of them driving the show. They're actually on the driving seats of how conservation needs to be steered and how conservation needs to benefit the people. And maybe lastly, it's actually about the benefits that is now trickling down to the communities without the elite capture. And therefore, that is my piece on what actually makes conservation difference between today and previously. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Maybe, Hilma?
Yes, I fully agree with Daniel, but I also think that what makes it different today, especially from the Namibian perspective, is the enabling policies that we have in place and also government buy-in to recognize the role that communities do play and to also give them the rights to really manage and be the custodians of wildlife within their land. That recognition that communities do have a role to play and the enabling policies behind them really set apart the conservation model and approaches that we are implementing today.
Hilma. Pine?
Yeah, I agree on what my colleagues have contributed. I think what's different is that conservation is inclusive and not exclusive. It's people-centered, and that the people are at the core of management of conservation. And this brings about fruits, there's less noise, there's peace, and it's the fact that communities benefit in the process, the conservation is critical, it's important, and the land to be conserved is huge. And the fact that governments alone have no enough resources to put into this process, communities are critical to be part and parcel of the process.
Thanks, Pine. Conservation is inclusive, not exclusive. Vatasu?
Yeah, I think that Payne and Daniel already said everything, but what I would add is what has changed. Like today, it feels like communities, there is an increase of the awareness of the communities, of the fact that they are important and they need to be recognized for their traditional knowledge. So I think that is the change, that that rise of communities that know that they have the knowledge and that they need to be well involved in the conservation. And also the fact that there are lots of recognition from I would say from the case of Madagascar, recognition from the government and also other stakeholders about the important role of community-led movement.
Great, thank you. So just thinking about scaling and how we build and kind of what message you all have in terms of how to accelerate and strengthen these approaches. I mean, you've mentioned a lot of priorities and keys to success, the enabling policy, collaborations, generating real benefits, Hilma, as you put it, in Namibia, kind of unlocking the economic asset. But if you were to pick kind of one key recommendation, maybe to the world around how to accelerate community-driven approaches and how to bring these to scale, what would that be? And actually, Emmanuel, let's bring you back into the conversation and reflecting on the presentations. Maybe you could give us a few thoughts on kind of what's the key thing to scaling and strengthening based on that, and then we'll go back through the panelists just with some brief thoughts on that.
Thanks, Fred, and thanks presenters from all Kenya, Tanzania, Namibia, and Madagascar. I think one element that is picked out is really sending back the benefits of conservation to communities. And that can always be linked to enabling policies and legal framework. Fred and I, for over the years, have looked into how communities have been benefiting differently from different countries, from Namibia getting 100%, Tanzania maybe up to 60%, Zambia up to 30%. So this is key. They should not be just conserving, they should be getting tangible benefit, because land, natural resources for them is life. It's not just a leisure. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Emmanuel. Let's go back to the panelists. Maybe start with Pine. Your thought on what's the key really to strengthening and scaling these approaches?
So for me, I think recognition is key. Communities that are at the center of conservation should be recognized, they should be valued, and they should be respected.
Great. Hilma?
Yes, I think avoiding blanket approaches, but also availing and designing long-term financial options for supporting conservation interventions is key.
New financing mechanisms, new ways of generating benefits.
Yes.
That's Sue.
Yeah, I think my answer would be quite different, because I think that what needs to be done is first that we are talking about community-led movement, but we know that we have different names like LMMA or PMU, or there are lots of names. So I think we need to start first with a standardized definition of what is community-led movement, what are the different kind of community-led around the world, and then that would be easy to really support them and replicate. But I would also suggest actually the creation of national network per country. Like for Madagascar, it's the national network of LMMA, and we can see that it made everything easier in terms of finance and stuff like that. So I would recommend that is where we can also prioritize.
Yes, Sophia? You're muted, Daniel.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, much has been said, but I think just want to add very briefly a couple of things. One of them is, in order to accelerate this, strong governance is very key. We're talking about inclusivity here. We're talking about fair distributions of benefits, fair distribution and sharing of benefits. The second thing is that we also need to understand very clearly that conservation is a form of land use. And therefore, for it to be sustainable and scaled, it has to compete with other economic land use. So increasing value of land under conservation, which can be done through looking at alternative funding mechanism or revenue streams, talking about carbon, cattle, and all those other things. Then finally, is also to the world. I think this is also something that can be accelerated through direct and intentional support to the grassroots local organizations. Because by doing so, I also believe that is also an avenue to really be able to accelerate the growth of the conservation, community conservation in Africa.
Yeah, absolutely, Daniel. And I think, again, all of your work is a great example of where that leadership is coming from on the key issues, on the key models, and doing conservation differently, as you all described. Well, we're just about at the time. I think, just to sum up, and when we're thinking about, as we talked in the beginning, the global conservation agenda, and Emmanuel, you put it very well, a lot of what everything is converging around is this question of rights and question of benefits. How do we make conservation viable for local people, inclusive, contributing to their lives in a positive ways, and changing policies and laws, and that enabling environment, as you pointed out, Helma, has been so key to what Namibia has achieved. And how can we all work together to find opportunities in the things that are happening this year to strengthen that and quicken that pace of change, to give communities more rights, to provide the financing and the benefits that they need, and also that leaders such as yourselves need. So we've had a flurry of specific questions come into the chat just in the last few minutes. We'll be sending out a recording, as many of you have also asked for. We'll send out some additional resources. We'll see about trying to address any specific questions that are asked to specific panelists. Look out for the ICCA Consortium's big global report coming out in May, and communications through that. Yeah, thank you all so much for taking the time to join us from wherever you are around the world, and to all the panelists as well for your insights and great presentations across the board. There's links to everyone's websites. Encourage everyone, check out more. And again, we'll send out some additional links, resources, recent reports relevant to everyone's work. And hopefully you can learn more about all these organizations and the critical work that they're doing. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, Fred and the team. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.